Oh, okay. So this one is on nihilism, the root of the revolution of the modern age by Father Seraphim Rose. This was written after he passed away. So this was written post-mortem. And I found this book, well, extremely enlightening, no pun intended, but also extremely interesting. And it definitely reaffirmed a lot of beliefs for me. Obviously, Nietzsche loved to go into nihilism too. And it was nice to have an Orthodox Christian viewpoint on this and to have a little bit more of a reaffirmation and a little bit more of a grounding as far as functionality goes. And it being a philosophical critique from an Orthodox Christian standpoint, instead of just it being another book review or another critique, as far as like the West likes to do. So it's just, like a vapid kind of critique, not a really good one or a functional one when comparing notes kind of thing. So the first chapter is the name of the book, The Root of the Revolution of the Modern Age. And he goes into detail with that being like the setup, obviously, because you got to set up a book and set up the narrative for which it goes through. So it's one of those things where that whole thing is how the root of the revolution is getting started and how these things relate to one another and how that kind of thing carries itself through to ultimately with that revolution being nihilistic. So I mean, it's one of those things where it's comparative to how these political ideologies, I guess is the best way I could sum it up, basically communism, fascism, capitalism, and any other isms you could probably throw in there, are ultimately going to wind up in nihilism. So he made a very Nietzschean kind of emphasis and kind of point on that to set up the rest of the book. Now on chapter 2, atheism, and in parentheses it says realism. Yeah. Well, if you don't believe in God, that's going to be pretty nihilistic existence. It's going to be pretty listless. It's going to be kind of just, wavering and not having any concrete kind of beliefs and not having a really good viewpoint and direction, just kind of just out there. And without the belief in God, when there's plenty of reaffirmations that God exists, atheism gets just destroyed on its cover. So atheism is another sense of nihilism because you don't believe you came from something created. You were just born out of nothingness. It was just there. Yeah, it doesn't work. Doesn't work in like a created kind of universe. So it's a hard thing to really get a clamp down on. It's a hard thing to really digest and stuff. And obviously, on a book review video, don't want to get into too much of the theological context here. But as far as atheism goes, that was his whole thing from the viewpoint of God, or believing in God rather, and actually, having some weight to that belief. Chapter 3, New Age, parentheses, Vitalism. Oh boy. Talk about the whole the pan heresy of ecumenicism coming into effect. It's there. And I'll revisit that in a later chapter with this. Yeah. Needed a drink of water to revitalize myself, pun intended. the vitalism of the New Age and it reconstituting itself and posed as something as New Age, but not really New Age. It's, just nothing's new under the sun. So it's just a reiteration of empty mysticism. And I say this about the West all the time, and the emptiness and that they lack the Western doctrines and dogma is they lack that sense of mysticism. So therefore, it causes people to get into those New Age paradigms and to kind of chase after that white rabbit, so to speak, and them wanting to believe something. Now, I guess a modern Gnostic belief system would be a simulation theory, and hence the white rabbit. I just made a Matrix reference there for a reason. So when it comes to that kind of vitalism or revitalism or revivalism or another kind of thing where you can just add another ism on top of an ism and it's just going to be the same thing. That is just one of those things where that New Age is not really New Age. It's old age. It's not, well, old age. it's archaic. That's the best way. It's an archaic Gnostic paradigm. It's an archaic pagan paradigm. It's something that's going to derive itself from an old belief system and a belief system without God, without Christ. So it's just going to turn itself and distill itself into the culture. And it comes from something like Hinduism, Buddhism, or like something from the East that really doesn't have a distinguishable deity or a distinguishable monotheistic deity attached to it. And chapter 4, nihilism of destruction. Wow. Short chapter, pretty simple. Ultimately, nihilism leads to destruction. I mean, what more could be said? That is one of those things where it leads to not only personal destruction and self-destruction, but destruction of society. And in defiance of God, you're destroying it. And then on to chapter 5, the theology of nihilism. Yeah. Theology of nihilism. Interestingly enough, I touched on that a little bit with the New Age. The chapter on the New Age. Theology of nihilism. It is something as simple as not believing in God to something as complex as into believing in other gods. So it's one of those things where you can wind up in a lost mess of sorts, to where you start to believe and start to get pulled every which way, that you start believing in those pagan things, those Gnostic things, those things that are not that just don't come from God, those belief systems that are not null and void or just listless of God. So it's one of those things where that God doesn't, God is not there. And make another Nietzsche reference, goat is tot, God is dead. Ultimately, that's in a way of what he meant when comparing this kind of, his whole thing to this book. So the theology of nihilism is ultimately going to wind up in more nothingness. It's going to wind up in more vapid disbelief in God. As for chapter 6, the nihilist program, that one's a little bit more conspiratorial, but definitely important. Definitely important to somebody who is Christian. Definitely important to somebody who wants to care about their religion and needs a reaffirmation, such as Christianity. Because you can see that people are always trying to find something to replace the very spiritual thing that they lost. So it's there. It's there in bushels. It's there in a lot of ways that the nihilist program will ultimately try to replace belief in God, which has been a very real thing and a very real, well, I mean, if you want to call it a conspiracy theory, very real thing that has kind of ran wild. I'd like to use that a little bit more, because those things can run wild, both ways, both extremes. So you need to be careful of that. But to not realize that there is ultimately more of a humanistic agenda than an agenda without God, then you're just, you got putting your blinders on. You're not even recognizing it. So there definitely is a nihilist program going on. As to how successful they can become to go against God, well, good luck with that, because you're not going to. But that program is there and it's instilled and it keeps moving itself along. So there's plenty of things that you could call it, plenty of things that you could call to get you banned off the internet for sure. But as far as a simplistic way to put it, there is one. So, and I mean, the Orthodox Church stands firm with it. And then finally, chapter 7, Beyond Nihilism. Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know what else to say, but being beyond nihilism. So belief in something. This is obviously written from an Orthodox Christian standpoint. So obviously he's going to be pro that, as am I. But beyond it, that's hard to say. That's hard to say outside of, what I believe and what he believed. But wholeheartedly, it is beyond nihilism. And to, people that believe something that I don't, that is beyond nihilism. And who's to say, that is something that you wouldn't believe to ultimately wind up back in the same spot that you were before. So it's one of those things where, you have to look beyond it and hopefully believe in something that's good for the soul. And we like to say, as we always do after Pascha, Christos aneste. Christ is risen. Truly, he is risen. And that helps to ease a lot of the nihilistic stuff that's going on around the world, and to help reinvigorate and revivify the faith and the faithful.